So yes, I'm from Ottawa, Kansas, and I started an institute called the Gwartney Institute. Jim Gwartney is a person who worked with Milton Friedman, actually, on the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And so this is a number that we're going to talk about today in a little bit more detail, but I just started this last year, and we focus on freedom, justice, and human flourishing. So I have as my first slide here that we started a podcast, if any of you listen to podcasts, where we explore the overlap of faith and economics. And we kind of have different issues. We don't get too much on heavy jargon of econ. You can see some of our topics that we've had there. And so if you're interested in that, you can check that out. All right, so I wanted to start off with you guys thinking about why should we trade with each other before we get into the index of how it works at the country level. And so here I've imagined a couple washed up on an island. Had you seen the American movie Castaway? Castaway, where he goes on the island. So that's Tom over here. Tom is the washed up on the island, and I'm imagining that Jen washed up on the island too. And each one of them has to face decisions on a given day. So do we go harvesting coconuts or do we have fish? And so on a given day, Tom can do 8 fish and 8 coconuts, or 4 coconuts and 12 fish. Jen, of course, being different, has a different set of opportunities. 4 coconuts and 8 fish, or 3 and 11. Who's better at making stuff? By looking at those numbers. On a given day, Tom can do A or B, Jen can do A or B. Who's better? Tom, right? So Tom has what we call an absolute advantage in production. An absolute advantage, if you remember that from your principles class. And so what we're trying to set up here is, why would Tom ever want to trade with Jen if he's better at everything, right? He's one of those people that sometimes you hate, right? They can dance, they can sing, they're good at sports, they're really smart, right? So that's Tom over here. He's kind of good at everything. So I want to think about Tom's production possibilities. So what I've done is I've just simply plotted point A and point B, coconuts, fish, right? And if we think about the cost to Tom, in order to get 1 more fish, he has to give up 1 coconut, right? So we got a 4 for 4, a 1-to-1 trade-off. So if we think about the cost to Tom, if he was operating in isolation, so if Trump was to say, we're not going to trade with anybody, if we were protectionist thinking, not open to trade, then that would be the trade-offs for the country of Tom, if you will. And then Jen over here, her trade-offs between point A and B, if she wants to get some fish, she has to give up, but her trades between point A and B are 1 for 3. Now, if you think about it then that way, who's actually better at fishing? Who can do it cheaper? Jen, right? Look at that. 1 fish costs Jen 1/3 of a coconut, but how much did it cost Tom? 1. Right? So even though Tom was better at both things, it turns out Jen is actually better in terms of what she has to give up to get another thing. That's our principle of comparative advantage, right? And so with trade, we operate on the principle of comparative advantage, and that can lead to some good results. So as we look at this, maybe we should have Jen do the fishing and Tom do the coconuts, right? And then we can get together and trade with each other. Kind of sets the stage for how we might organize society's resources a little bit better. So if we push it to the extent of full specialization, Tom goes ahead and does all the coconuts, but he maxes out, of course, on a given day, he can only do 16. And Jen, we're going to send fishing, she can do 20, and then she can't do no more, right? That's fully dedicating all of her efforts towards fishing. So what happens now is that the world's production possibilities have changed dramatically by focusing production in one area or the other. So now imagine this outer ring here is the world's production possibilities. This point right here is a combination of Jen doing 20 fish and Tom doing 16 fish. Remember, he could do 16. So if both people did all the fish, the world could produce 36 fish. Now, if we're thinking we need some coconut water to wash down our fish with, who do we send to get the coconut? Jen or Tom? Tom, right. So now we're going to send Tom, and we're going to give up a coconut, or we're going to give up a fish, we're going to get a coconut. And so this orange line is really sending Tom out for coconuts, right? So if you think about this line of Tom's kind of coming over and creating that section of the world's production possibilities. Once we get up to XC, point XC, if we still want more coconuts, who do we got to send? We got to send Jen, because now Tom is maxed out. And so then we start to follow Jen's production possibilities line, and that's why that one's blue. So what it says is that if we organize production to where we have the best efficiencies, we could be anywhere along that outside area. If instead we have each person doing a little bit of fish and a little bit of coconuts, we're going to be somewhere inside. What did that mean when you were somewhere inside the production possibilities frontier in principles class? If you were inside the frontier, were you being efficient? No, right? And this shows that. So XA was like Jen and Tom both doing point A, and that's both doing point B. Now here's the exciting thing about this, is that if they were both doing things, we can move from XA to XC, and how much did it cost us? How much did it cost us to move from XA to XC by having people reorganize to what they're best at? Almost nothing, right? We got both more fish. If we have opportunities in our lives to have more of everything, do we want that? Is that a good thing to try to get? Not bringing in moral considerations at this point anyway into it, right? So more is preferred to less. So if we can move from XA to XC, that's a good thing. Okay, so that's kind of the idea here with trade. And so now what I want to think about is, how does the marketplace evolve? So now imagine we've got Tom having all of the coconuts, Jen having all of the fish. And Tom throws out an offer and says, hey, Jen, how about 2 fish for every coconut? Is that a good deal for Jen? He says, how about 2 fish for a coconut? In other words, Jen would have to give him 2 fish to get 1 coconut. Is she getting screwed? No. What would she have to do if she wanted one and had to do it herself? What would it cost her? 3. So 2 is a deal. Well, wait a second. If she's getting a deal, then Tom must be getting screwed, right? If Tom gives the 2 fish for a coconut, is he getting the raw end of that deal? So if he gives up one of his coconuts, how many fish would he get if he had to go do it himself? 1. Whoa! I get chills thinking about that. It's like I just created magic, right? Coconuts and fish everywhere. It's amazing, right? This is the market. This is capitalism. Each exchange through voluntary individuals creates a win-win situation. Both parties win. Both parties win. So often we kind of get the mentality that when I just went to Oakland, right? Oakland Mall. You know, I went to Oakland Mall and so often we get the impression you go to Oakland Mall and you pull out some Q and you give it to American Eagle, and American Eagle gives you some clothing. It's like they won and I lost. Is that true? No, because what did I receive in return if I bought a 100Q shirt? I got the shirt, right? How much is the shirt worth to me? More than 100. That was a trick question. Who said that? Hey, all right. That's good enough here. That was kind of a tough question here. So this is a Guatemala Institute shirt. And this is our Twitter handle, 123 Poverty Sucks. So that is what we got there. So we're going to give that to you. Look at that, even got it to him. All right, so how about that? So yes, we get that. When we buy something and we gave $100 and it's a voluntary transaction, in other words, I didn't have a gun at my head to go to American Eagle and buy that, I must value that shirt at least 100Q, right? Maybe I value it at 150Q. And so then I profited 50Q off that trade, right? And of course, we know American Eagle paid less than 100Q likely for that shirt, right? So they profited, I profited. Win-win situation. All of this we take for granted in a market system where we're making those trades day in and day out. Okay, so here is all of our consumption possibilities. So remember, Tom was producing all the coconuts, and this green line now shows all of Tom's consumption possibilities, right? And the most striking thing here is that right away, Tom is made better off all the way, right? If they strike up a trade price of 2 for 1, then Tom can be at point D. Tom could never be at point D on his own. Remember, he was the super stud that was good at everything, good at coconuts, good at fish, but yet Tom has an incentive to trade with Jen because he can be made better off by better utilizing what we're good at. Same is true for Jen. We can get off into higher consumption possibilities than we could do on our own. All right, so that's kind of our trade story. So how does that, economists are kind of famous for putting all together these little models with various assumptions like, okay, Russ, well, that was fun for a little island with make-believe Tom and Jen, but how does this work in the real world? Well, in the real world, we have society composed of households, right? And so we have little guys and big guys and women and men and people who want to work, people who are retired, people who are disabled. That's the households. And about half of them, at least in the United States, I didn't look at the data for Guatemala, but it's usually pretty consistent across countries. About half of them, during some part of the day, go over here and use their comparative advantage, what they're good at, to meet with other people in a collective action process and make stuff, right? So that's comparative advantage, the concept of Tom and Jen kind of scaling up for the whole economy. And then, of course, they come back here. So economics is really about all of these households. And so we look at capitalism as a means of trade to help put more smiles, get more coconuts, get more fish. But that is how we kind of use this principle of comparative advantage. Hopefully you guys are getting some stuff put into your brain here at UFM that makes you more marketable, something hopefully you're passionate about, that you can be productive during your time in the workplace as well. Okay, so that was just kind of a prelim. Here's kind of the real talk. I wanted to make sure we got some of those nuts and bolts down, because now that you're going to see the connections here to Tom and Jen. So, as I mentioned, Jim Gortney was an alumni of Ottawa University, and he's the one that originated this economic freedom index, getting consulting with Milton Friedman. So he was in pretty good company for that. And so here's how he defined economic freedom. So individuals have economic freedom when property they acquire without the use of force, fraud, or theft is protected from physical invasions by others, and they are free to use, exchange, give property as long as they don't violate the identical rights of others. So that is the idea of when a country has economic freedom, you can do that, right? You can do that. That's economic freedom if it exists in your country. What we're going to find is that in various countries, that isn't always equal, right? And that's where we get the discussion going. How is it not equal? Well, in different countries, we have different levels of government spending. Some countries have bigger governments and more taxes. Some of them have lower. If the government's taking more of your paycheck, that's less freedom you have to go buy something, right? So if your taxes are high, that is infringing on your individual freedom to buy something with that money, because the taxes are not voluntary, right? The Guatemalan government doesn't come around and say, okay, how much would you like to give this month, right? They're forced on you, so it's an involuntary amount that is going that way. Provides access to sound money. So does the Quetzali, does it remain fairly stable in the sense that tomorrow, if that shirt was $100 at American Eagle, what's it going to be priced at next month? Is it basically $100? Then it's pretty stable money, right? Your purchasing power is pretty stable. In other words, we don't have a lot of inflation going on. Protecting property rights and contracts. So what's the court system like? Are people able, if somebody does violate their rights, can they go to the police, go to the court to get that resolved, right? Are their property rights really protected? How are they on trade barriers? So if you are free in your country to buy stuff from the United States and stuff from China and stuff from other places because there's a free flow of goods, that gives you more freedom, right? More opportunities. So we're going to look at international trade. And then finally, regulations. What sort of regulations are there on people's work? Is there a minimum wage? Can you fire people? Like when I visited India, they've had laws on the books a long time that you couldn't fire anybody, basically, right? So do we have resources able to move to their highest and best use? What's done next here is to compile a whole bunch of data from 162 countries. Some countries don't have good data. So North Korea, Kim Jong-un is not really willing to, give out data and have an open, transparent books. But for most countries around the world, there's data available to look at and digest. So within each of those countries, there's 42 variables that are compiled together so that we ultimately boil down the country to a single number. A single number that's the overall rating for that country on how much economic freedom there is, right? So that's the concept. We're going to get into it a little bit more. This was a recent change to it, that are women and men treated relatively equally or very unequal? Some countries, there's a lot of inequality between men and women, and so there's an adjustment made in the legal system there. Okay, so there's officially the 5 categories that are compiled to make this number. Size of government, which is going to be a combination of government spending as well as tax rates. So it kind of looks at how much are they taking from people. The legal system, what's the laws like? Do people feel fairly protected? Do people have access to sound money, freedom to trade, regulation? All right, so once you do that, you can rank the countries by that single number. And here's the globe. Here's Guatemala. Now, what we're going to do tonight as we look through the data is we've taken all of the countries and broke them into 4 quartiles. So the blue countries are the most free. So the United States is up there. What country is Guatemala? Or what color is Guatemala up there? It's blue. Ooh. That gets into my talk here. Why is Guatemala blue? Last time I checked the news, there's Guatemalans trying to come across the border to the United States, but we're blue and you're blue. That kind of made me think, what's going on here, right? What's going on? All right, so we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we got Australia, China, I just came back from South Africa last week, actually. And so that's down in the 3rd quartile. So you can kind of think about areas around the world where you might want to live or places that you'd like to visit, and you can look up the economic freedom in each country. Okay, so here's our top 10. So Hong Kong's been in the #1 position for a long time, and Hong Kong is kind of a unique story because they broke off from the Great Britain, right? So we had the break off in the 50s, I think, if I remember my history. I'm not that good with those details, but they listened to Milton Friedman. Part of the details that the Brits said, if we're gonna let you guys go, we don't want you to go back to communist China. And so we're gonna let it go, but we're not gonna let you go back to the communist ways. And so what they did is they wrote a really tight constitution that rested on the rule of law rather than the rule of man, right? So rule of law versus rule of man. And so Hong Kong has had a really tight rule of law. Even within the last year, there's been talk about communist China keeps kind of chomping at the bit, like, oh, Hong Kong, wouldn't you like to come with us and try to change things there? But they've been holding tight. So New Zealand, Ireland, United States, so that's kind of our top 10 on the economic freedom list. Here's some other countries. So Germany, 20. Guatemala is 23. Your guys' faces is the face I had when I looked it up and I saw Guatemala was 23. Okay, so you're kind of in this range. So then we get Italy and France, Turkey, Russia kind of moved. And then, of course, you guys know what's going down south, right? Bad news, 162, rock bottom by a long ways, is poor Venezuela. You can see the numbers and the detail that came out. So what this number does, by the way, is it hasn't been done by a group of really smart elite economists that are like, oh, well, they don't really do much business there. We take survey data from various sources and compile all that data and just let the data be what it's going to be. And that's part of where we're going to tell a story about Guatemala. So this is not a ranking that's done by, Harvard economists, ivory tower economists that are crunching out things, or some government bureaucratic office, but rather it's just survey data from a number of sources that gives us this final number. Okay, so we get a number of different implications from looking at economic freedom over time. So the world has been getting more free. That's some good news. So in general, we've seen more freedom, and the income gap. Now you guys hear about the income gap a lot. How many of you, if I said, is the income gap shrinking or getting wider between the poor and the rich worldwide? What would you say, wider gap or shrinking? Wider, right? Usually people would say wider. I heard some shrinking. Maybe that's because you guys are UFM students and you know better, and I kind of set it up there. But we kind of have these alarm details going on, but the data's showing something different. So here's economic freedom over time and the gap between developing economies and industrial economies. And so you see an upward trend, and the gap is the vertical height there. The gap is shrinking. So we are seeing income inequality among nations shrinking. So it isn't, remember, it's among nations. So within each nation, it could be something different. But among nations globally, it's doing that. And we get some pretty impressive results looking at it over time. So over time, we've got the high-income countries, the 21 highest income countries, growing income at about 1.25%, but developing countries growing at 4.75. And you can see that that's where the gap is shrinking, right? Their income's growing faster than the rich countries are. So we kind of do that type of analysis of looking at how much that gap is shrinking, what is economic growth, changes in income over time. Another interesting experiment that was purely natural is when the Russians, the communist Russia, left the former centrally planned countries alone. So the Soviet Union broke up. What year was that? 1991, good. So 1991, it created kind of a natural experiment because after Russia said, go for it, you guys are free, be free, right? Letting the birds free. Well, some countries developed more free market ideas, And other countries stayed more communist, right? More centrally planned, where decisions were at the top. And so what we find here, according to the way we have economic freedom ranked, is that countries in the top 7 have grown at 4.5%. Countries that stayed a little more communist and less free grew slower, right? So where did that come from? Just in how we organized freedom. All those freedom issues that I listed at the beginning, they were more free market oriented in those countries, and it really creates a wonderful, what economists call a natural experiment, right? We're just letting countries go, and they chose how to organize themselves, and that's what we found. Here's some summary data of economic freedom. Okay, so look at this. We've got income, most free, least free. So countries in the most free area versus the least free, and according to their freedom, right? So the blue are the most free countries. That's the quartile, the first quartile, and this is the least free, that last quartile, like Venezuela's in there, right? So Hong Kong's in here, bringing up the top, and we see a pretty dramatic difference in income. So this is average income. I mean, and this has been all adjusted, if you remember from your macro class, purchasing power parity and all that jazz. It's been equalized. So it's not like, oh, rice is cheap in Africa. No, all of that's been equalized, purchasing power parity. So we are talking real welfare of things you can buy when you bring your Q to the mall and you buy the American Eagle shirt. That's what we're talking about. You can buy that many more shirts in the most free countries versus the least free countries. So here's a little bit on economic growth. So again, the most free countries are growing faster than the least free countries. Here's one that's a little more near and dear to my heart. This is the income earned by the poorest 10%. So remember what my shirt said? What did it say? Poverty sucks, right? So this is one of my passions with this movement and getting this knowledge out to people, is that look at how much better off the poor are in free countries versus the least free countries. Significant amount of money. This is double. So that's double the amount of things that you can buy. And remember, all that purchasing power parity stuff's been adjusted. So it really is better material well-being. I mean, I almost laugh when I go to different countries about our poor, American poor, when we go home. Our American poor have air conditioning, a cell phone, a 50-inch flat screen TV, a house with a good roof. I mean, that's how our poor live. Now, we have relative poverty, right, where you're always looking at, oh, that guy's got $40,000. I've only got 11, right? But that's a different story than really the material things that get looked over for the poorest 10%. So that's good news for poverty. Here's another one on extreme poverty. So this is the fraction of people on $1.90 per day or $3.20 per day. So we almost don't have that going on in the United States. I mean, it's going to be just an anomaly where that is going on, that type of extreme poverty. I've seen some information where, guess how many people died of starvation in the United States in this year? 0. Nobody dies of starvation in the United States, right? Now, in other countries, that happens. So starvation, unless somebody killed them by starving them in their basement, one of those serial killers or something. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about not being able to feed yourself, right? So that is a huge difference here, of course. When we start to look at extreme poverty in these least free countries, of course, Venezuela is at the top of the list, where people are fighting in the streets to try to get some food. Life expectancy. People live longer in free countries. Almost 80 versus 64. How many years is that? 15, 16 years? Is that a good chunk of time that you can enjoy things and relationships and people and being on this earth? I mean, is that something that's important? Yeah, we're not talking just about money and wealth creation and having more coconuts and more fish. We're talking about living longer, right? So our living standards are dramatic. And again, we see this going down with freedom, that there's a connection here between most free countries and least free countries, even as we stack. We seem to see that same theme as we put the countries into these quartiles. Political rights, civil liberties. People tend to have more choices, more democracy, right? So more freedom. Gay and transgender rights. You tend to have more of that. That would be part of our civil liberties, right? So you tend to have more of that going on in free countries. So it's not completely about just making money and having material things. We get these other things that are correlated with it too. And by the way, I'm not saying that there's a causational relationship here. They tend to go together. Kind of studies have been trying to go on which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? Which came first, economic freedom or political freedom and other things. But they tend to kind of go lockstep together, and it tends to be kind of path dependent, history path dependent on how that evolves. But nonetheless, that's the type of correlation that we see. All right, and here's gender. Where do you want to live if you're female? Most free, right? So this was that gender equality aspect. So more free countries tend to have more equality between the genders. Another nice social outcome that we desire, different than just money. Happiness. We're happier being free, right? We get more happiness. So happiness is kind of a weird thing. Maybe you remember from your micro class, it's kind of a slippery thing to try to estimate. So this is on self-reported surveys of how do you rank your happiness on a scale of 1 to 10, that type of thing, right? But given what it is, that stuff is reported each year, and we tend to see people in freer countries, again, self-reporting happiness at higher levels. All right, so let's talk about Guatemala. So what's wrong with economic freedom? So on our website with the Guatemala Institute, I wrote a little blog here that you guys can check out and check out on our site. If you go to you got to hit the blog button, and then you'll find this. You're going to have to do a little digging over here to get to it. But a lot of what I'm talking about tonight is what I wrote there. It's not real long. I think 900 words or something like that. I was excited about coming to Guatemala, shocked, as I've said already, that they were ranked 23rd. And I talked with some people from Guatemala. They were perplexed by it. In fact, that's why I'm here today and tomorrow to talk about it, because it kind of posed an interesting issue of what's driving that result. So Guatemala scored a 7.64. What I've got here is the first quartile, second quartile, so I kind of called it averages of different components so that I could try to dissect it. So I was being a forensic economist, right? I'm kind of digging in, trying to see what's going on here. And so that was how I started. And within each of those numbers, remember, there's 5 categories. So these are the 5. I'm bringing you back to the 5 that we did before. And so it's size of government, legal, money, freedom to trade internationally, and regulation. But now what I've done is I've given you the United States in blue, the average of the first quartile, and then Guatemala, right? Within each category. So we're digging we peeled one layer off the onion to see what's going on. So what is Guatemala dominating in? Size of government. Well, that's interesting. So that means in general, they've got not a lot of government spending, not a lot of government transfer payments. That's what I call Robin Hood theory. Take from the rich, give to the poor. Take from the employed, give to the unemployed. Take from the healthy, give to the sick. Right? Take from the young, give to the old. We've got all of those in the United States, right? To the point where we're actually at almost 70%. It floats between 65 and up to towards 70% of my tax dollars. If I give $100 worth of tax to the United States government, about 65 to 70 of it is going towards that. We're not buying weapons of mass destruction and toilet paper for Trump's butt in the White House, right? That government spending, it is going towards transfer payments. So that's a large part of kind of the dynamic that's going on in the United States. Some of you might know that they just had the Democratic debate last night, and so as usual, the Democratic Party kind of wants to give people lots of stuff, and Republicans are tending to hold back, but Trump is unusual in that regard. He likes to spend. He was a real estate developer, so, build the wall, spend money on infrastructure, so he doesn't mind running deficits. And it's part of his mentality, being a real estate person. That's what you do. You borrow money to build something great. Make America great again. I don't know if it's going to work out, but that's what he's doing. I'm just kind of trying to explain the different types of mentality that go into the size of government. So does your president and your leaders, do they believe in that type of thing, or do they believe they should be small? You guys believe it should be small, or your leaders do anyway, okay? So the size of government is better than the United States in terms of the impact, which is giving you more freedom in terms of money in your pocket because of lower taxes and less spending by government. And here is the size of that number for all of the average of the rest of the first quartile. Okay, now, what areas do you kind of fall short on? Legal system and property rights, check it out, right? And then regulation. These, you're okay. So freedom to trade internationally, you guys are pretty open, right? You don't have a lot of trade barriers. You're okay buying and selling stuff from other countries and whatnot. In fact, you score higher than the United States, especially, of course, this number doesn't even reflect Trump's increase in tariffs and stuff that he's been toying around with, hopefully trying to make, I'm still holding out hope. I've been saying this for almost too long now, though, but I'm holding out hope. I actually say a few prayers once in a while. Dear Lord Jesus, please let Trump be playing a long game where the tariffs are kind of a bluff to make the world a freer place. That's what I hope, and that's what I'm holding out hope for. But as the months and years go on, I'm starting to get a little scared here where this thing's going. All right, so you guys are pretty good in that too. So yes, this regulation. So I wanted to dig down a little bit deeper then into those areas. These are the rankings of you worldwide. So you're at 110 out of those 162 countries. You're 110 in this one. Not so good. 114 in regulation, right? But what are you in government? Number one! Everybody, we are number one. We are number one, right? So you're number one, right? So you need that big foam. I should have brought a big foam number one thing that we could chant. So you guys are number one here in size of government. So, is that good or not? I don't know. We'll see where that plays out. All right, so digging down a little bit deeper, is it good that your government is that small? That's what I kind of want to tease out there. Especially I wrote this in my article, as a free market economist, it makes me uncomfortable kind of questioning that. Shouldn't the government always be smaller, Smaller, less spending, less taxes, shrink. But check it out. This is the average for the most free countries, right? And this is the average for the second average. This is government consumption, transfers, and subsidies. That was the Robin Hood stuff. And then this is the amount of government spending. Here's Guatemala. So if we think about that, why are you number one? Because you're beating every category of all the other countries in those two components. You're way higher on everything. Okay, so I'll just kind of leave that one float and we'll kind of circle back to that. Is that the right place to be? So legal system and property rights. So you were at that 110 spot. Why is that? So I'm just going to read these off. Judicial independence, protection of property rights, integrity of the legal system, regulatory restrictions on the sale of property, business costs of crime, impartial courts, military interference in the rule of law and politics, legal enforcement of contracts, reliability of police. These are some of those 42 categories I talked about before that are within this sub-area under the property rights. And so I put this up here. I know it's a lot of data. I don't expect you to digest it all. But the ones with numbers on top, you're doing kind of okay compared to, second tier free countries. This is the most free countries. Here's Guatemala. So on those, on that one especially, 8.33, you're higher. That's on regulatory restrictions on the sale of real property. In other words, sounds like you guys can sell stuff if you want, right? Just like Tom and Jen on the island. If you own something, you can sell it. You don't have to go to some bureaucratic office and get a permit to sell it. Like, oh, can I do this? Oh, sure, sir, but you'll have to, I'll sign here, but you got to take it to the next office over to have them sign it and rubber stamp. And they got to put their stamp, and it's got to have the right seal. In some countries, there's more red tape to having to do that. But in Guatemala, it looks like it's pretty good. So what are the ones you guys are awful at? So here's the awful ones: impartial courts, integrity of the legal system, legal enforcement of contracts, reliability of police. Is that true? If I'm in trouble out there, good luck. 911 doesn't work very well here. They don't come very fast. Business cost of crime. So this is businesses reporting how much they have to absorb because of crime, like how much their cost of doing business goes up. Is that a big factor? Is it a small factor? That's what that is. So I'm saying, from a policy standpoint, with young minds like yourself, these are the areas that I think Guatemala should start with. These are areas that are lacking, that are causing that freedom number to fall down to 110. So if I was consulting with your politicians or other people that are decision makers, but more importantly, the grassroots of people, I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know, right? And it's like, oh yeah, of course. No, they never come, right? So how does change happen, right? So all this report does is it helps identify the areas that are really glaring problems with Guatemala and causing the numbers to be a little bit different. Let me try to get through a few more things here. So regulation, the other one that you're low in. 114. So here is labor market regulations. By the way, you were pretty good on credit regulations. So as far as the banking system and being able to borrow money and participating in global capital markets, you guys are pretty good on that. You don't have a lot of regulations on capital flows. But the labor market, again, we see some things that you're awful in. I put the things here that you're not too bad in, like here, the gray one, centralized collective bargaining. So unions and people being able to be centralized to kind of control things. Apparently, it's not a problem in Guatemala, because you guys are scoring higher than the second free countries and the most free countries. You're doing pretty good on those areas. So what's the low-hanging fruit in this area that you might need to work on? Hiring regulations and the minimum wage. Is the minimum wage high here? Not too bad? So this is part where we'll see how much time we get, but I'm hoping to learn from you guys, because I didn't go research all this stuff. I just kind of looked at the data and said that. So I'm anxious to learn from you guys to bring some stories back to the United States, and maybe I'll do some more writing on Guatemala after I learn, get some feedback from you guys. But hiring regulations and minimum wage, that area, in free countries, it's 7 in the United States type countries, right? And your country is 3.3. Even in the second tier, it's 6.6. You guys are 3.3. But remember, you're one of those free countries, supposedly, but not in this area. So this area, all of those 5 areas are equally weighted. So I know we got a lot of good math people in here. So it's a simple average of the 5 areas. So it's possible, since you guys are so dynamite in quotes here, in the size of government, that is dwarfing some of the failures in the other areas, is part of why we're getting that low number. Mandated cost of worker dismissal. So again, there's some costs incurred to the companies that on how easy it is to fire them or dismiss them. So there's some restrictions that we don't have in the United States, for instance. Pretty much in the United States, depending on some states, but if you're not doing good, you're fired. You guys ever watch The Apprentice? That's what happens in the United States. That's how easy it is. You're fired, right? And you're gone. And you walk out and you pack up your stuff, right? In other countries, and apparently Guatemala has some sort of restrictions there that are holding them back. And then conscription is having to do some military service. Are you guys required to do military? Is there something with serving with the conscription? Okay, that's one I want to dig in a little bit deeper on. I'm not sure where that number is, why that's so low, but that one's coming up low too. All right, and then I had to put this one up. This one actually isn't holding your number down too bad because it's one subcomponent, but I just wanted to let you know this doesn't really happen in the United States and other countries. If you're going to be a blue country, if Guatemala is going to stay in that top tier, then we usually don't do the bribes and stuff like that, right? So that's something not going to be, I know that that's not easy to change though. It's very cultural. India is really working on trying to change that and having a difficult time of it because it's so ingrained into the culture. Okay, so here's what I think where Guatemala really is. So I think Guatemala is probably closer in the 50s if I do some adjustments, which the actual ranking does not do. Here's my methodology. I took Guatemala and I created the country Guatemala Rus. I think it has a nice ring. So Guatemala Rus, all I did is I just played with the numbers and I substituted the two areas of government consumption and transfer payments. I substituted the average that is true in the most free countries. So I hypothetically said, if Guatemala had be spending a little bit more money and had maybe some higher tax rates, which again, almost hurts me to say as a free market economist. This is all hypothetical, so I know this is being recorded, but if that was the case, and the other areas stayed awful, holding those constant, right, that ceteris paribus assumption, then Guatemala's ranking from 23 falls to 54. And that puts you in the second quadrant at 54. Still at kind of the front end of the second quartile, but it's out there. So here's my kind of policy recommendation for Guatemala that might catch some fire and I'm willing to take some heat on. I think it's kind of looking like maybe a good government, which I know is a big assumption in public choice theory, but more spending should be done in guess what areas? What areas, if we're going to ramp up government spending, it's always important. It's not good enough to throw money at problems. But what should the government spend that money on if it did go up? Property rights and those other areas, the legal infrastructure regulations, right? The things that I identified there. So my thought process, my recommendation to Guatemala, Guatemalans and otherwise, is that maybe we need to have a little bit more spending in the right places. Now, maybe you're spending money in awful places right now, and maybe you just need to substitute, right? Oh, let's get rid of that stupid spending. That's just a corrupt official that's taking money out of the system. So if we could stop that and spend the money on beefing up the police with proper training and trying to change things that way, maybe that would work too. But what the numbers are telling me is that you guys have enough freedom in the amount of government spending now. I think you could consider possibly some changes that direction too. All right, so my last, close to last, one of the last slides here. This is a new research thing. I just kind of came upon this doing this for you guys. I was curious about this whole, is it possible that government can be too small? right? And of course, we know government can be too big, Venezuela. So is there kind of an optimal size of government? Certainly the government shouldn't be zero. That's anarchy, right? And we'll run into problems, some of the problems that we have maybe here in Guatemala with whoever's got the biggest stick wins, right? Whoever can beat people up can kind of control the resources. So you need some level of government. What's the right level? Well, look at what I found by stacking these. This is quartile number 4. This is you guys. And I have the actual numbers up there. Here I just did it in this type of diagram. So your average per capita income in Guatemala is only about $8,000. And in the United States, it's $57,000. In the average of the most free countries, which by the way, that average includes your average of 8, right? So you're bringing down the average, by the way, just so you know how these numbers are working. But the average of all those 40 countries is $42,000. But check it out, 6,000 and 14,000. 6,000 is the least free countries. That's over in Africa, a lot of them, and then Venezuela and those other ones, right? So those countries are at 6.4. You guys are at 7.9. They have too much government. Maybe you don't have enough. I say maybe. This is not like hardcore science here, right? But that's what this information is showing. The countries that have a little bit more government, the quartile 3, they're at 14,000. Higher incomes than Guatemala again. And then we go up and then we come down. So I think there's at least a little evidence there, and that's the part that I haven't had time. I literally just kind of uncovered this little morsel yesterday as I was preparing for today. And I thought, oh, we might have a journal article in here somewhere, right? By thinking about that, but maybe somebody's already done it. I don't know, so we'll find out. All right, that is the presentation.